Sweet. No pressure.
We're live.
Oh, you've.
We did it. I think
We are
so. Live from Transfigured Studios. I have Kale Zelden. You are a teacher at a boarding school in Rhode Island.
Correct.
And a viral fashion influencer.
Yes, apparently, yes.
And Moises is a pastor in the CRC and a resident of this little corner of the internet.
Yep.
And so we are going to be talking about Harry Potter and the spiritual significance of Harry Potter. That's not a joke. And Defense Against the Dark Arts and what that means for us now.
Yeah, that the other screen is doing. It's a little bit
bit
of a lag.
This one is a lag.
Yeah.
But so we've got the comments and turn that off.
Yeah. Don't get distracted.
And we get the comments over here. All right, that works. Kale, how did you first stumble on Harry Potter?
So I stumbled across Harry Potter. I was teaching at a high school back home in Louisiana, and a bunch of the ladies were all excited about this third book that was coming out of the series that I had kind of vaguely heard about. And I was frankly kind of annoyed by it. And they're like, oh, you've got to read this book. You've got to read this book. And being my arrogant, snotty self, I was sort of like, it's kids' books. I'm really not interested in that. And I sort of played that card until a few years later, I got married, and I decided I was on my way back from the wedding. We were flying back home, and I saw it in the bookstore at O'Hare Airport. I decided, what, I'm going to pick it up and what's the hype about?
So there's a Chicago connection.
There is, yes, there is. Yeah. And so I read it and I liked it. I mean, it was a kid's book. Mm-hmm. I liked it, so I could. And at the time, I was really deeply immersed in the screenwriting world, and so I think I had my view tuned to design, and I could see that she was doing something, even though the sort of the language of the book is oriented toward a younger reader. And so then I quickly bought 2 and 3. I loved the character of Gilderoy Lockhart. I thought, this is one of those things. I remember cartoons when we were kids, mm-hmm. that you enjoy the cartoon as a kid because you think the character's funny, and then you see the cartoon when you're an adult, you're like, oh man, there is a real critique going on, mm-hmm. of a certain kind of type. And so that really locked me. But I would say it was number 4, The Goblet of Fire. And I'm reading these very quickly.
Yeah.
And so that would have been in 2005. And I'm reading these very quickly. And I'm starting to tell everybody, like, Mom, you got to read this. My wife, Demi, you got to read this. And 4 was the one that blew open for me, that this was, a whole world was opening up, and she was way better than my sort of initial reaction.
Yeah.
And so then the last book, I had to wait a month or 2 before it came out. So that was kind of exciting. Mm-hmm. I was in line at Walmart in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and, it's a college town, right? And so we're all lined up, and it's midnight. And some of the locals were like, they're in line for a book? It was the funniest thing. Like, yes, nerd here, guilty as charged. So yeah, that's how I got into it.
Cool. And Moises, we've previously talked about this, but how did you get into Harry Potter?
So for me, it was a bit late. I mean, so I watched the movies first. I actually watched, I think, every movie at opening night in Chicago, because my niece read the books and she was really involved. So I took her, but they were, in my opinion, they were kids' movies at the time. I probably fell asleep through a couple of them because they were like midnight showings.
Yeah.
Right, that's right.
And so, but kids' movie, I never thought about them really. And then really 2020, during the lockdowns, I caught one of the movies on TV or whatnot. And I was like, oh, I should revisit this now that I have time to watch all of them. And I was caught by the relationships in the movie, the children, and progressively the dealing with loss. Especially because for me, growing up, I grew up in a rougher area, and losing friends, family, especially to violence, it was common, and it doesn't hit you as a kid. It's like, oh, I mean, it sucks.
It's around, but
but also in 2020, I lost a close friend of mine, and it hit so much harder, and it even confused me. Why is this hitting me harder now? I've lost other friends before, but the movie kind of helped me see the difference of loss, you know, especially Goblet of Fire, you see it, and Harry responds to it a bit differently than Cedric's father. And then you see when he lost of Sirius and so on and so forth. And so I was like, wow, these are actually much better movies in communicating some of these things than I thought. And then after watching all of them, I was walking through Target and saw the first book on the stuff. And I was like, you know what, let me try this out. I was curious about reading them more from the comparison of book to movie.
Sure.
Which the first one, it's almost identical, but with a little bit more depth.
Right.
And then they get bigger and bigger as you go along. But after I finished each one, I was like, I have to start the next one. Like, I need to keep going. And then since 2020, I've read them about 5 times.
Through? Yeah. I've read them. I don't know you, Sam. I've read them through. So I read them through initially, and then I did a reread, and then I've been through them 3 times now. And I think I finished the last one the last time, probably in COVID. Interestingly, I think it was the same time I was revisiting them. And again, just they're moving. They're real. You know?
And I have never been moved in that way from a piece of fiction before. Since then, there's been other pieces of fiction that have moved me, but that was kind of like almost the cracking of my cold stone heart.
Your cold nonfiction heart.
Yeah.
I was almost perfect age for them when they came out, but because they were sort of a fad, especially among girls, I was like, you know. And I remember I read the first one pretty close to when it came out, and my parents were a little bit cautious that it might be, you know, witchcrafty and bad. You know, tuned into that sort of Christian right warning about these things, but my parents weren't quite at, you know, that level of strict about these things. So I read the first one and I was like, oh, I really liked it, but I also hated reading at that age. So I just kind of let that fad blow me by and let it to, you know, the kind of nerdy girls in my class.
How old were you when the last book came out?
Oh,
what grade were you
what
in?
year did Deathly Hallows come out?
2007, I think.
So that was when I was graduating high school.
Okay, all right.
And that's about the same age that the characters are.
Yeah,
almost.
so right. So when I went back into the classroom that year at 07 or 08. It might be 08. But anyway, I went back to the classroom and I was teaching a group of sophomores, and they had basically kind of grown up with it. So that was an interesting phenomenon as a teacher, you know, like, oh, like everybody reads now, you know. Of course, it didn't really turn out to be the case, but a lot of, you know, so that was that cohort that read them. So it's a similar thing.
But then, like, after I graduated college, I had a little bit of time before I started my first job. And I think I had them, like, my sister had them on her shelf. I think my sister probably read them right around the times that they were coming out. She is, like, I think the same birthday as Harry Potter to, like, the date and the year. So my younger sister was, like,
really
perfect for it. And then I'm like, you know, I've got some time to kill, so I'll read these Harry Potter books. They're lying around on the shelf. And I read through them in like 2 or 3 weeks. Like, just blazed through them. I'm like, my goodness, why didn't I read these earlier? But I almost feel like, while it is cool to read them as the same age as Harry, I actually feel like I'm almost grateful that I delayed a little bit till I was a little bit older. And then I think I've gone through them 3 or 4 times. Once on audiobook, I actually really like
it's
a
great
good audiobook.
It's a great production. It really is a great production.
With voices and a little bit of music around the edges and stuff like that. I feel like that's actually a really enjoyable way to do it. But I think that one of my controversial opinions is that I think that Harry Potter has more Christian theological depth than even like Narnia, and that it is a little bit more subtle. Like, Narnia is not particularly subtle sometimes, but that it has a deeper theology in it in some ways than a lot of more obviously Christian literature. And I was texting with Tripp and Luke. I've been reading through Narnia with my kids recently.
That's what I've been rereading them.
And like some of them are like kind of slow, and there's some parts that are a little bit like not the most compelling. But like, I feel like Narnia flashes of insight where C.S. Lewis, you know, shows how good and smart he is. But then there are parts of it where he's not like a great children's fiction writer the way Rowling is.
Yeah, you know, I was reading something, God, this just this past summer, and he dashed those off pretty quickly, and at least that was my appreciation of it. And, you know, of course, did not have the full conception of the 7 books until probably the third book, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that Rowling has trained us on is almost a kind of precognitive appreciation of design and form. When like I said, so I was reading these, I was working out in Hollywood, and one of my screenwriting mentors, she was following the books as well, and she was like a real genius in terms of story design and structure. And she wrote a book after the sixth book came out. She wrote a book called What's Going to Happen in Book 7. It was a kind of predictive. I don't know if you remember, there was this moment where, like, anyway, it's a great book, and I wound up doing, I was one of her proofreaders for the book, and so really sort of saw the sort of the setup and payoff design of this whole thing, and she predicted a ton of things that you know turned out to be correct. You know, some particulars here and there different, but so I think that is where Rowling really jumps ahead of the pack, and there's something really satisfying about that setup and payoff structure.
And there's also a difference in the audience of the time, right? What kids were aware of, and what, to a certain degree, what they were aware of, even within the realm of Christianity, was different back then. People don't get catechized at the same extent that they do these days, and so to a certain degree, for it to communicate those Christian themes, you have to put a lot more, and you have to make it a lot more explicit now, because it's not perceived the same way as it would have been back then. Because I went back and read the Narnia afterwards, and it was hard for me to read it even.
It's hard at first, you know. So I found even in this sort of go through right now, I'm in the middle of I just started the Dawn Treader.
I finished the Dawn Treader 2 nights ago.
Okay, that's interesting. It's interesting, and it's there are these moments, like you say, where you're just sort of blown away by some little turn of phrase or a little turn, you know. But you're right; it doesn't have quite that kind of consistent unfolding.
You don't end a chapter and immediately feel the urge to turn the page.
Now, that's the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That's the one where they're heading out to find the 7 lords.
Yeah.
So there's a good YouTube channel called Into the Wardrobe that I follow every now and then. It talked about those 7 lords representing the 7 sins, which for now, maybe some people might be aware of them more because of the movie 7. But back then, it probably would have been more well known, the 7 sins. But that's something, reading that book, I would have never even connected.
That's right. Yeah. And I do think, you know, to back up Lewis here a little bit, I do think he was engaged in a very subtle thing, you know. So I don't, you know, we're comparing apples, you know, they're different things, you know. But I do think that he was engaged on a sort of a very, you know, almost cryptic, apologetic or design, you know, but it's of a different kind,
right? And he's better at sort of like the ontology of the world, and like in Harry Potter, it's like we don't have any creator, we don't have any sense of why magic is even a thing, or we don't get any, we don't get told where it came from or anything like that.
That's exactly right.
Ontology and origins and cosmology is just assumed, whereas C.S. Lewis has that in. But I feel like Rowling is better at like the interaction between theology, symbolism, and psychology, and from like a personal aspect. And that her characters are just way richer and way more developed and interesting, and you follow them around. Like some of C.S. Lewis's characters are just so boring. Like they're just almost like, sometimes they feel like ontology sock puppets.
And there's a lot of depth in almost every single character in the Harry Potter series. And so how I've conceptualized it is, I feel like to a certain degree, Narnia is trying to help understand God or Christ, especially Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, whereas the Harry Potter series more how to be a Christian. How do I understand my role in this adventure?
And to your point, the way in which friendship is it's almost like the fundamental, you know, there's no society, there's no sociality absent real friendship. And I think one of the reasons why the series sung so profoundly to a generation and to all this, I'm older, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is that it really speaks to that fundamental teenage need to connect, to have friendships, you know, fellowship, you know, and I think, and she really gets into the complexity of that, you know. Yeah, so I think her genius is psychological, but like from the inside out. It's interesting.
Well, and not only the friendship, but also the familial aspect of it, because she demonstrates that the friendship cannot remove the familial. I mean, you see this most clearly with Sirius Black.
Yeah.
He almost leaves his family, but that family always comes back for him, to the point where his cousin ends up killing him. And you can't escape the familial. It's always going to be there. And then you see the friends at the end, even the trio, they all become family. Through marriage and whatnot.
That's right. Yeah, you know, but it's funny, I wasn't expecting to talk about Lewis, but you know, you look at the book that kind of made him famous was Screwtape, right? So it precedes the Narnia books, and I think it even precedes the Ransom trilogy. In fact, I think it even precedes Mere Christianity, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Mere Christianity happens, and then, but it's all sort of close to the beginning. But you know, the Screwtape Letters is just profound, insightful psychologically. But it is like it's sort of more individual. I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that. You know, so it's not like Lewis was incapable of that kind of deep, psychological.
I just think it was just a difference in purpose. And to a certain degree, I know that there are some certain aspects of Christianity that Rowling puts in there on purpose. But I do think there's a large amount of it that she doesn't do purposefully.
Do you think, like,
she's just trying to find the best story that she can?
Right. I kind of think of this almost precognitive, you know, again, almost sort of to a little bit from the Holland thesis. Like there's, you know, if you pursue the truth of story, you're going to run into these deep undercurrents that are actually Christian.
Yes. I mean, even the connection of friends and family and how that works together, and there's the pros and cons. Those are Christian themes there. And it's a Christian understanding of family and the pros and cons. I mean, I think of one of the things I was thinking about over the past week is some of the three characters that have experienced early childhood trauma: Harry, Snape, and Voldemort, right? And so you have
the different ways of handling
where you have Voldemort. I hate my Muggle father. I refuse to take his name. But I'm also kind of ashamed of my mother. I don't take the Gaunt name, but I create this new name for myself. And then you have Snape, who also hated his father, but everybody knows him as Snape in a kind of a hateful way, even that's his father's name. But how he knows himself, how he identifies himself, is the half-blood Prince, which is his mother's name. So he still loves his mom. Like he still has that familial love, which he ends up putting onto Lily. And that love lasts forever. And then you get the last chapter of the last book where his name is pointed out specifically. And as to why. Like James is mentioned as one of the children of Harry Potter, but Sirius is the one mentioned as the brave one. And so that love ends up being part of the Potter family. And it's like that there's a Christian theme there. This is why God gave us the family. But he doesn't say be exclusively the family. There are people married in, even to the point where you have Rahab, a prostitute, being into the line of King David and Jesus himself. Ruth, a Moabite, the enemies of Israel.
Your God will be my God.
Has grafted in to those divine lines. So it's like she did that because Rowling did that because it's true. I don't think she was thinking about this great theological concept.
And I think it's probably important to probably put that caveat onto this entire conversation. You know, is you know, there's an author's intention, and you know, and clearly she's an author with intent and design, but there's a way in which a poet is merely a kind of conduit or pass through for something more, especially if the poet is being true to the muse. You know, we have all these kind of language. I think it's Eliot. I think it's T.S. Eliot has this line where he says, and somebody can fact check me, but that a poem means more, not less, than what the author intends. And I think that's just, you know, so that's a kind of sort of a fundamental bedrock, like the way that I teach literature to my students, is that, you know, if you could sort of get an interview of Rowling, and she says, well, this is what I was thinking. Like, that's interesting, but it's not exhaustive and it's not conclusive. It's actually like, okay, good, but your story actually means more, not less than.
Whereas a science textbook doesn't mean any more than what's on the page.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, there's something weird, about story.
Yeah.
That and that's why good stories, profound stories, are enduring. They last past the generation, and they rhyme and resonate with old stuff. That and that over time, those things that endure almost by necessity resonate with one another.
And I mean, Peterson says this all the time, right? The Bible is the greatest story because it's lasted and it's been, and
or anti-fragile. It's like it's anti-fragile in some kind of way.
And so any story that's gonna get close to that level of greatness is going to have to be able to resonate with it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
Although when you have your main Messiah character die to defeat evil and then come back from the dead, and any person from a Christian culture should know what they're doing there. And so I do wonder how much she is wrestling with Christianity consciously. And I think another thing that is different between Harry Potter and C.S. Lewis is that Harry Potter deals so much with death, and Narnia, there are not a lot of deaths in Narnia, but Harry Potter really focuses on death in a certain way. And to me, I almost feel like Harry Potter is in some ways J.K. Rowling wrestling with the question of how could God send his son to die and that be like a good thing as opposed to a terrible thing. Because there's that one scene where Snape and Dumbledore are arguing because Snape is starting to see Dumbledore's plan that involves the sacrifice of Harry, and he is repulsed by it, and then Dumbledore's sort of having to defend that. And I feel like that scene is kind of right at the heart.
But I think there's an interesting aspect of that in terms of today's modern culture is the way that we understand death. I mean, it's like, especially in the first world, is death is the worst. How could we tolerate death? During COVID, we're going through 0 COVID deaths as a standard. And painting that picture is that death can be a good thing. The sacrificial death, not only can it be a good thing, but as Christians, that's what we're called to, is to take up our cross, lay down our lives for our friends.
Right. Because the constant, right, is death and taxes, right? We're all dying.
Yes.
Right. And so it's the peculiarly Christian attitude toward dying is that you can, well, it's not this part is not peculiarly Christian, but there's a way to die well and there's a way to die poorly. Right. And so in fact, I remember reading an encyclical of Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. It's and he talks about that early on in the ancient world, philosophy was not so much an academic discipline. It was the study of the art of living, the art of living and dying. And so there's this whole sort of early tradition of Jesus, the philosopher, and that Christianity really spoke to the idea of, yes, we're going to die. So how do we, in order to figure out how to live well, you have to figure out how you're going to die well. And I do think that Rowling is wrestling with precisely that issue.
Yeah, and also recapturing. So there was the ancient idea of living forever isn't necessarily our consciousness going on, but kind of you have a kid that keeps your name up, and that's the ancient idea of living forever. That seems really weird in contemporary society, but I think she brings a bit of that again with the names. Severus lives forever now. He continues on through Harry's children and so on and so forth, is that you sacrifice yourself so that something of you can continue on. Now, I don't think that's an absolute version of what it means to live forever, but there's some truth behind that.
Yeah.
And even right there in the first book, there is who's the family that has the Sorcerer's Stone that then decides
the Flamels, yes.
Right. And so they sort of voluntarily sacrifice their immortality such that Voldemort or any other nefarious character couldn't grab hold of it.
Right.
And so that wrestling with immortality right? And the Deathly Hollows are 3 different ways to try and evade death,
right.
and all those sorts of things. And Harry finally brings them all together, but he uses them to defeat Voldemort through death, as opposed to avoiding his own death.
Yeah.
Right? All of the Deathly Hollows come together to help him basically destroy the evil power of death.
And what's interesting about that is actually it doesn't come together to defeat the power. It comes together to protect those that he loves, where that power ends up defeating itself.
Yeah.
And that's what I found so interesting, is that he comes, and the last line that Dumbledore gives him is, "Do not pity the living, or do not pity the dead. Pity the living, especially those that live without love." Who's the one that lives without love? Voldemort. And so Voldemort is a self-destructive thing. And at the end, what does Harry tell Voldemort but show some remorse? Try to have some... He's showing the pity for this man who has lived without love. And it kind of teaches us how to love your enemies. Like, even the worst of the enemies, which is Voldemort, at the end, Harry is demonstrating an act of love there for this enemy who ends up destroying himself.
I wonder what you make... I've always been intrigued by the Death Eater thing. You know, what do you make of the fact that Voldemort's crew, right? You know, what is the difference between, you know, eating death versus whatever? You know what I mean? It's always been an interesting tag to me, because
part of me almost feels like I'd never thought about it very much. I thought it was just sort of like a scary gang,
badass,
like
right.
Hell's Angels or something
right.
like that.
And I had initially thought that too, but then as I think about it, as I chew on it, there's something about trying to incorporate, to eat death. I don't know, and of course it's tied up with the Horcrux stuff.
Yeah,
too,
and what does
right?
it mean to eat? Right, you consume for the sake of sustenance.
Yeah.
So death is what is the fuel.
Yeah.
For us, and to a certain degree, the fear of death becomes the fuel of the Death Eaters. You know, it becomes what keeps them going. It keeps them loyal. Death is what keeps Voldemort attached, you know, to the Horcruxes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things I haven't really thought about.
Yeah.
Right,
off
like,
the top of my head.
Yeah.
Voldemort's trying to defeat death with death in like a different kind of way.
Right.
Right. He's killing others to keep himself alive, as opposed to
So it's taking that gifting. You know, if you look at that pivotal scene when Harry dies, you know, it's the fundamental gift, as opposed to taking. You know, and again, paradoxically, it's something that Voldemort cannot understand. It's just that he can't bring himself to understand or to be with that idea. The notion of self-sacrifice.
Yeah, and what's interesting, he can't bring himself to do it, and it's not an intellectual thing. It's a pride thing. Like, he can't get past, this little boy is going to tell me to show some remorse. Like, he knows Snape, he knows this magic better than me. This 17-year-old average more than me. I've defeated everybody.
Yeah, so David, you know, this is David and Goliath, you know, a replaying of that, it seems to me.
Yeah.
You know, that, you know, what you sent out this ridiculous, you know, errand boy, like, what is this?
And Harry explains the whole argument. Like, this is what happened. This is exactly. And to a certain degree, on an intellectual level, Voldemort could be like, oh yeah. But he doesn't. And we see that now, right? With all these debates that go on. There are one that comes to mind the most is like a Sam Harris. Yeah. Like, intellectually, he's been given all this stuff, but he can't accept it. Yeah. He just can't, and it has nothing to do with intellect.
And it's what you know. One is tempted to say it's not that he can't; it's that he won't.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
He won't let himself.
It's like there's you were willfully. I am not going to go there.
Yes.
You know, and it strikes me, you know, that, you know, people aren't convinced, you know, but are not rationally convinced typically. You know, we in fact, what is it? The inversion. You know, you just get better at rationalizing the things that you kind of want to believe or think or do.
And it's funny, that conversation's happening in the midst of a literal duel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It is an actual duel and a war. And so the ideas of the conversation are sort of like, they're dramatized by the whole battle that's going on between those two individuals and all of the people behind them. And like that's what makes it, I don't know, just like spark with energy in terms of the psychological depth that she's wrestling with in ways that I don't feel like C.S. Lewis ever quite really achieves to the same.
Well, and there's all the
dramatic
payoffs in that in the Battle of Hogwarts. Like, I mean, Percy coming out. And the prodigal son returning to the family and apologizing. Amazing. Yeah, I mean, I cried when I read that.
I get goosebumps just even you just bringing it up.
Molly Weasley defeating Bellatrix. And even that one's such an interesting one because Bellatrix, as ugly as they make her in the movies, there's still a sex appeal there.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, maybe it's because
Bonham Carter is curious about your pant wear at the moment because you're blocked by the tail. Grim Grizz.
Okay, Grim, I'm wearing khakis right here. I mean, as if there would have been a question. I mean, I'm offended, Grizz. I'm offended. God, come on.
But Molly has been frumpy throughout the entire movie,
and she's like she's like the great image of mom.
Yes.
Yeah,
right?
the best scene is when Molly defeats Bellatrix. Is just
I mean, that line. I've watched a bunch of reactions to that line. Not my daughter, you bitch. It's just like it's the mama bear. It's like, and as much as maybe society might praise the sexy, competent, very strong Bellatrix, she gets destroyed.
Because the passion of a mom is stronger than, and that's one of the interesting things about the sort of the logic of Harry Potter magic world is strength is tied to the strength of your emotions and your feelings and your passion and your drive. And so what is stronger than the evil Bellatrix's passion for evil? It's a mom's love for her children. And it can't compete with that. And the magical power difference is often an expression of the strength of feeling or resolve or something like that.
Yeah, and I love that she demonstrates the maternal so well, but she also demonstrates the paternal so well through like Sirius being the godfather, Albus being kind of the grandfather figure,
and again very mature. I was particularly struck by the way that she portrayed James. Right, when Harry, who had sort of put James on this sort of pedestal, has to confront the fact that his dad was kind of a jerk to Severus.
Yeah,
it's like it's very honest. Like, because all of us have to come to terms, whether we have great dads or crap dads. All of us have to come to terms with the fact that our dads are human beings.
Yes, and not only that, but the interesting thing is there's never really a change of heart towards Severus, or at least not demonstrated. You don't see it with James because he dies and they don't get to it. But with Sirius still thinks of Severus in the same way.
No-go.
It's like they never remove their animosity towards him. Like they never come to, and it's like there's sometimes aspects of our character stay bad for all of our lives. That doesn't mean we can't contribute to good, because Sirius does. And Sirius is a much worse character in the book than he is in the movie. Like through the Order of the Phoenix, he's just this resentful whatever. Except for when he finally gets out and is able to help Harry. It's like I get to do something. And to a certain degree, he dies happy.
But I think even that, like, that's a profound insight into something that's fundamentally masculine, right? You can't lock a guy up in a basement for extended periods of time, hide without it really costing him his sense of purpose, his sense of it, all of those things that we talk about. So, so you really, even though he's a jerk, right? He's a prickly at best. It's only when he can kind of out himself. I'm back. Can he sort of find? You're right. So he almost dies happy. It's a really.
And also the interesting thing, like with Lupin, is like Lupin is seen of all the Marauders as the good one, the one with the good heart. And at the end of the day, he ends up abandoning his son.
That's right.
I mean, he comes back from it, but that's a significant character flaw, and it's because of his condition, which I think. Somebody said this, I don't know if it came from Rowling, that his werewolf is supposed to represent like the HIV aspect of it, which there's some depth there. Like you have this guy that represent HIV and maybe homosexual, but ends up marrying Tonks and has a son.
That's
and,
right.
There's
atypical, but yes, there's a way of even redeeming that. That's really good.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it, thinking like, God, kind of feels like the way that people are fearful of AIDS.
Mhm.
It's the blood, and and it's like I get tainted, and like, well, what are you going to do? Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, I think that's right.
So Defense Against the Dark Arts.
Yeah.
What role does that play in the books, and why are you teaching a Defense Against the Dark Arts class?
So I think as I chew on the idea, I think Defense Against the Dark Arts is about agency, and I'm not just making VNA jokes here. I really do think it's about inviting the uninitiated into a world in which they have agency to deal with things. Because look, I've worked at schools for many years now, and it's such a delicate balance. You in theory, you are preparing your kids to sort of fully take on their agency. I'm a high school teacher. It's part of what this whole process is about. Yet so much about high school can in fact be infantilizing. It can in fact be, no, you can't do that. But as it unfolds, you have to sort of slowly trust, as a teacher, I have to learn to trust my students that they are building in their capacities. I'm helping them define their capacities so that by the end of the year, they have more than they had when they walked in, right? And so I think that defense, for me, the Defense Against the Dark Arts is to remind people that even if we sort of face the power of the machine, or the power of the anti-machine or the power of the Ministry of Magic, or the power of the Death Eaters, right? That still there is space for agency, and in fact, it's not just space for agency, but there's a necessity to grab it.
Mhm.
It's something that's more important than order. It's more important than all these constructs, and so that's what I do in a high school context with my own students. But one of the things that I'm motivated by with the Defense Against the Dark Arts, I'm doing the Heart of Darkness thing right now, is that I find that, number one, there's much to be kind of mined from old books, and in part it's already what we've been talking about. The Rolling series taps into an ancient tradition and a perennial tradition, right? And so it's always been my contention that, again, this is very C.S. Lewis, but old books have what you need in them, right? And so it's not like something that's kind of encased in amber, but it's so it's not something you could just merely extract out from, say, The Magician's Nephew or Paralandria, but it's something that has to be kind of experienced, and it's a it's good to read one book. It's better to read 10 books. And if you can read 50 books, that all the better.
Yeah.
And so I find that a lot of adults actually have come to me over my time. I'm teaching their kids, and we're reading Dante and, Canterbury Tales and Macbeth and Paradise Lost, reading these sort of big old things. And they'll come into my classroom for visit days, and they're like, man, this is so great. I really wish I could do this kind of thing. And what I was going to tell them is like, well, you can. Actually, you can, but realistically, I know the lives that we all live. It's very hard to just like pick up a copy of the Iliad. I saw that Musk tweeted out the other day.
I got an illustrated kids version of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it tones down the poetry a little bit, and there are some parts left out. Like we managed to leave to fight Troy without sacrificing any daughters.
Iphigenia, for instance, right. So anyway, so I'm very happy that Musk has taken it upon himself to sort of amplify, the classics. That's great, but realistically, there are tons of barriers to that process. I mean, think about what you were talking about with Rolling. You'd watch the movies, you brought your niece, and there's a different barrier to entry for, okay, I'm going to read 7 books, and the first few are kind of like written as children's book, and then the 7th book is, or the 5th book is 980 pages or whatever. Like that's a significant barrier to entry, and so. But I still think that these things are worth it. And so I want to say, look, like you can do this. Like you can actually do this. And not only can you do it, but, and again, I don't want to be too nudgy, but like you should.
Yeah, you kind of need to.
Yeah.
Because the idea, in my opinion, of like the Defense Against the Dark Arts, especially as it's portrayed through this series, is there is evil out there. and you can't
Pretend.
fight it if you don't understand that it's out there and how it works. And to a certain degree, eventually you get to the point where you understand it's not that the evil is out there, is that the evil's in you too.
Right.
Potential for the dark
Very
arts.
correct.
There was actually a fan theory out there about where Avada Kedavra came from, the killing curse, that it actually may have been created. And again, this is all theory, it's all fiction, to kill parasites and predators. So it's something that was actually might have been created for good that has been twisted by the darkness
of course.
within people. And so you have to learn to defend against it, because you also have to learn to notice it inside of yourself. The shadow, if you want to get into psychology, within yourself.
The Voldemort Horcrux within.
Yes.
Well, but think about that moment. Remember when Harry essentially has killed
Malfoy.
Malfoy, right? I mean, Snape comes in, and but that's such a significant moment, because as much as we were all conditioned to hate Malfoy, and for very good reasons, right? Can't kill, So what is it, Septimus?
Sectum Sempra.
Right.
You can't do that.
And you need,
but he's capable of doing it.
Yes.
Like, we are capable of doing this.
And he's able
the
to.
Crucial moment at the end where Malfoy's mom is the one who's willing to lie about Harry being dead.
That's right.
That enables part of the thing to happen, because she doesn't care about Harry being dead or alive. She wants to get back in the castle to save her boy. Right. And
a mother's love.
Right. And the other aspect
and
is
if Malfoy were dead,
in the last book, Harry successfully uses the Cruciatus curse. Where initially he tries it on Bellatrix, it doesn't work. He's like, you have to mean it.
You have to really mean it.
Well, then he means it because he's defending McGonagall, one of the maternal characters.
That's right.
Of the story.
You have to mean it. That's so great.
Yeah, right. That's again that psychological.
But that's a tough thing, Like I don't know if I want to mean that.
Yes, and if you can't acknowledge, if you don't know how to defend against the dark arts out there, when it comes up in you, you don't know how to defend against it. And I find that there's where a lot of people are
to define the dark arts. So I think one thing that's interesting is that the Harry Potter series sort of is the narrative of evil had been away, or at least the obvious face of evil had been out of the public view in the wizarding world for a long enough time, where it was almost sort of like Defense Against the Dark Arts. What are we doing here, guys? Or like, this is silly, and like this is kind of a waste of time.
To be cute, but not. It's like kind of the way that theology class is treated in a Christian or Catholic context. Right. It's like, all right, let's start doing this theology thing.
It's like,
whatever.
Oh, the devil.
Whatever. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And it kind of slowly reemerges, and even at the end of the fourth book and other moments in like the fifth book, when it becomes obvious that Voldemort is back, there's still this denialism that is the first reaction.
Straight up. And then in book 5, what's her name?
Yeah, she's like, Umbridge.
Right.
We're going to have a theoretical.
Right. Yeah. She's like, it is not real. Like, that's the position. And of course, they're all the kids are like, how can you keep saying this? It's like, it is not real.
Yeah.
Don't believe your lying eyes. And so I love, we could spend a year talking about the brilliance of Umbridge's character.
Yes.
But I think dark arts are,
dark arts are whatever people that you think of as evil, the tools that they use.
Right.
And so whoever you are, if you're an anti-gun person, use of guns is the dark arts.
Right.
How do you defend against that? Right. If you're whatever you're against, whatever you see as the enemy, what their tools are the dark arts. Yeah. And so you need to understand how to defend against them, because those that you consider enemies, you will use their tactics, especially if you're not aware that you have that kind of darkness in you.
That's right.
And I feel like we're in a similar moment where we're struggling to like point at evil and say that is evil, because we almost view that as a little bit.
Well, it's déclassé.
It's déclassé, and perhaps we have been maybe in the recent past we've been too quick to overuse the label. Sure. Right, or to make it a partisan thing or something.
Well,
like that.
I think.
Then, although it's like it's at what point, like I feel like that's a lot of what's going on in the Trump moment. Is how do we use the evil label in a way that's sometimes pretty strongly partisan without just falling prey to partisan forces above us?
So two things pop into my head right away. Number one, you probably remember when Bush used the phrase evildoers, of course, very biblical language, the sort of, that was a scandal. But even more so when I was a kid, when Ronald Reagan gets up at, I don't know where it was, the exact context, but calls the Soviet Union, the evil empire. And I remember people like, oh my, how can you call, please, aren't we beyond these categories? And, again, whatever you think of Reagan, I mean, that was a real, there's always that kind of preacher element to a presidency.
Yeah.
And like that was, sorry to just quick little aside, I remember as a young boy, like the sort of the depressed vibe of the Carter years. And I don't think Carter's a bad man. I just full disclosure, but there was definitely this depressed vibe. And like Reagan, in part, I think understood that the role of the presidency higher. I think there are real limitations to that kind of potentially jingoistic, thing. But the Soviet Union was an evil empire. Right. Again, to say nothing of the sins of the American empire, we could talk about that. That's true too. Fine, but the Soviet Union was the evil empire, and so to use that kind of language, he was calling it, we need to defend ourselves against those dark arts.
Well, and I think one of the things is that we typically think of evil, dark arts as other. Like, that's something outside of me.
And that's the danger. If you label something over there as evil, then it can make you complacent looking at it within yourself.
Yes.
But I mean, part of it is, I mean, Trump is just such a weird thing because there are many things about him that do seem kind of evil. He's like
so with evil. Snape, right? Yeah. Even and this is one of the cool things of the mirror of the Goblet of Fire and the Half-Blood Prince. Is in the Goblet of Fire, you have somebody who teaches the defense against the dark arts really well, pretending to be a good person who's actually evil. Mad Eye or Barty Crouch Jr.
That's still like
the double agent.
It still boggles my mind.
And then you got the Half-Blood Prince, where you have Snape pretending to be good, pretending to be evil, but he's really working for good. And so, but both of them are very in touch with their own dark sides, and to a certain degree kind of embrace it. And so it's one of those things. This is the thing that boggled me about Trump, is like, all the dark stuff about him, that's kind of true. Similarly with Clinton and Bush, and with you and with me, like we all have that evil, but how do you decide which is actually genuinely trying to work for good? Well, you have to kind of understand how that evil works in you and how you're still trying to work for the good, despite the negative. Like once you get to know me, there's a lot of negative things about me. I'm still trying to work for good. And there's still some people that probably don't believe that even about me, but you can't even come close to understanding what's real unless you understand that those dark sides of yourself. I mean, to a certain degree, that's what I loved about Star Wars.
And I would say, except we think of TLC, and what a lot of what brought me into this whole space was Peterson and his insistence on the Solzhenitsyn thing. That the line of good and evil cuts through the human heart. And for me, that's almost become a kind of litmus test when I'm meeting people and dealing with people. Like, how do they think that? Number one, do they even think that they should think that? And how much do they think that? Because it really does require a level of humility to. I mean, I don't want to admit that I have this shadow, this dark side. I mean, I don't like that. It makes me uncomfortable. But I'm also old enough now and wise enough and done enough terrible things to recognize, like the sooner I acknowledge that, sort of the better. So to get in touch with that, it's almost, in order to be good, to do good, you have to kind of carve out that space for what the alternative could be in you and through you.
And you have to risk, to a certain degree, almost risk becoming evil. Like almost risk falling prey to the dark side. Again, the Star Wars thing, Luke has to he has to get close enough to be able to win his father back, so to speak.
And in the throne room scene.
That becomes really dangerous. But you see this like with King David in the Bible, right? King David, he's conquered Goliath, right? He conquered all the enemies. He unites the 12 tribes finally. And then he has an affair, and then has the husband murdered. He does some really awful things.
Dark stuff.
But he's still thought of as a great king of Israel because he did do great things. He also did terrible things to quote Ollivander.
Yeah. Also, that's great. That's right. Yeah, the wand salesman.
Yeah.
But we love there's something really compelling about a story where evil is very tangible and incarnate and flesh and blood and has a name, right? And Voldemort is like, obviously that, like, he has to. It's interesting. It's not until the fourth book that he's really able to fully incarnate himself.
Yeah, to take body.
Yes, to take body.
Move from subtle body to
right. And so, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, although sometimes it's really compelling if we are wrestling against flesh and blood.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's like this weird thing that we're struggling with is how do we keep that idea that, evil is really a subtle body and not flesh and blood thing, but it's always trying to incarnate and act through flesh and blood bodies, subtle bodies influencing the flesh and blood.
And you think of Sauron, and the move throughout the Lord of the Rings for him to take body, right, is, and then the various temptations of all the good characters to deal with this.
And there's a spectrum to how people give in. Like you think of Draco Malfoy character, right? Who he's pretty much evil. You can see him as evil, as in the way the kids see evil in the first books, and then he gets to Half-Blood Prince, where okay, now it's time to live into that evil all the way.
So are you gonna?
And he's trying, but he's battling because he's not all the way there. And to a certain degree, even his father at the end, loses so much. It's like,
and his mom's just fed up with this evil thing.
and you want to put.
I have to hope all these people in my house. They're trying to kill my kids. I'm done with this evil thing, guys.
I did not see this in the contract.
And you want to put people in these boxes of the good and evil, and it's just like, well, where do you put Draco? Where do you, they don't fit that exact caricature. There's so much nuance there. But that doesn't mean that there are people acting on the side of evil.
No, I know. So do you think that as we sort of try to think of the whole thing, thinking about it in terms of defense against the dark arts, it seems that you have to, we don't have the luxury of thinking that evil's not real. And so much of the early energy is sort of how much are you going to invest in mechanisms that can hide the reality of evil as being a real force in the world. But then, so the more you have to kind of acknowledge it. But it's not just, as you say, it's not just saying like, oh, evil's there. Like there's the shark.
In-group, out-group binary.
Right. Yeah. That all of a sudden it gets really complicated, cutting through heart, cutting through family, cutting through, all these sort of things. And what is the cost of pretending? Maybe that is so much of that drama, really getting all the way up until really book 6. The cost of pretending is massive. And so, so to get back to the question, what is defensive against the dark arts and why? I know that there's some folks, who don't like this Dada thing, and part of it's a little bit of tongue in cheek, but I want to insist that Death Eaters are real. Like I want to insist that evil's real, but I also want to insist that this is here too.
And that's I forget which new atheist it was, but said, whatever is true of the universe, the cosmos, is true of the atom. Like it layers up, use the Pacheco's fractals. And so it's like evil exists in the world. It exists in my world. And the deepest parts of me, it exists there. And so you have to combat it. And you can't ignore it. Like, right. So I did this thought experiment. What if Harry Potter never got the letter? What if he never went to Hogwarts? Well, evil's still coming after him. Voldemort is still trying to embody himself and will come at him later when the trace wears off, when he no longer lives in their household.
The 18-year-old.
And he wouldn't be able to defend himself against it at all. He's destroyed and the whole world goes to crap. So defense against the dark arts, the whole magical world is absolutely necessary to combat evil. And what is the entryway to the magical world? King's Cross Station. That's right. Yeah. Right. And that's the entryway to being traded.
Diagon Alley, but
Yeah. Well, Diagon Alley there's the magical world there, but to get to learn, like to get the training, to be able to even navigate Diagon Alley, you need King's Cross Station.
Yeah, and you need to get to Hogwarts, right? And so Hogwarts, if it's a properly functioning Hogwarts, you don't need the room of requirement, right? If all of these courses and teachers are sort of firing on all cylinders and doing what they're supposed to be doing, but what happens when the formator, the formation machine, to sort of use that language,
gets hijacked and corrupted by Umbridges.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and there's always this was a really interesting about like the Matrix, is that Neo along with the Smith are the mathematical aspect that they can't get rid of, that they're trying to come up with calculations to get rid of these anomalies, but they always exist. And so there's always going to be the anomaly. Like people always say that regardless of what kind of government system, there's always going to be the potential for corruption. There's always going to be the rising up of the anomalies. Yeah. And to fight one anomaly, you need another anomaly. Right. And so the rule of requirement will always be required. Right. But it's not the norm.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, that's good. I like that. And so I look out into the world. I guess I do. I guess we all do. And I believe that there's lots of pretending, and that and you don't have to agree with me here, but I would think that, it's close to, 99% of our institutions that are allegedly oriented toward the formation of the next generation are thoroughly corrupt. And not only are they just sort of doing a bad job at the job they're supposed to be doing, but they're doing an
anti-good job.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, if people want to accuse me of being a culture warrior, I'm just telling you what I see. I'm just telling you, you would think, for instance, with all of the sort of the confounding forces that operate against our children, right? And mine are a little bit older, I know yours are young, but it's like, it's so manifest. It's so obvious. I'm sure you see this as well. It's, to pretend that doesn't exist is just, I don't know how you can do that. Number one, but number two, like that we need to equip them. And this is, again, one of those things early on that I was always really struck by Peterson, is that, you can't protect your children. And, and I kind of knew that, but I never really heard it. Just, you can't protect your kids. So stop it. The only thing you can do is you can equip them. You can raise their competency or whatever.
Make them strong enough.
Because invariably, you're not going to be. You can't be there 24/7. You can't. Yeah. So and we all knew this because we grew up, right? We understand the nature of temptation. We understand the nature of all these sorts of things. And so to think that you can just fully curate and weed the garden to perfection.
If you just had the perfect Christian classic homeschooling network.
Right. So this is, I think it's interesting that the three of us Christians are sitting down here. If you recall, and you mentioned that your parents they were like, whatever, it's not that, there were a lot of Christians who were like, this is bad. This is bad.
My dad read it and was like, oh, this is like Narnia. Never end.
Right. But so much energy was like, oh, this is bad. And where was I going with that?
And it was intense. Like that was back when the Christian right actually had the power to try and cancel things out of the public square and out of the common culture. Well, that was kind of nice. Maybe.
Well, and it becomes tricky,
that, even though we missed
because there is a spectrum there, right? Because to a certain degree, there are things that children shouldn't be exposed to,
right? Of course.
And so that's why the parent ought to be able to navigate that. But the goal of equipping. But you said, how can people not see that? Well, what's the first temptation when you're attacked? You cover your eye. I don't want to see.
I can't see. You squint. Yeah.
That's instinctive. Yeah. And so you the way you get over that is you train.
Right. Exactly.
And so that's the thing, is we need to train people. But for somebody who's never trained, not only is that the instinctual, that's what you do when danger comes, but you think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I remember in this vein, I was listening to an interview of a boxer, and like that's not my thing. I'm not even like I'm not an MMA guy. Like, it's interesting, but just not, whatever. It's not my thing. But I remember he was talking about what it takes, like why are boxers impressive, and basically it boils down to, if my memory is correct on this one, is like you have to learn to overcome your instincts, and so instead of flinching away, you flinch in, and it is in this overcoming practicing, exercising, that you overcome, and so you're increasing your competencies by becoming counterintuitive to that first instinct.
Yeah.
And so your second nature as a boxer is lethal. So it's just such an interesting
and then what happens later is then you have a respect for the craft,
right,
and you don't approach every fight all the time because you know that there's consequences there. And so people have actually suggested that as an antidote to bullying is teach martial arts or self-defense, boxing, whatever. Antidote to gun violence. Train more people with guns. Actually, there's an old rapper, Killer Mike, that he really strongly pushes that.
Wow.
Because once anybody that goes through a gun safety training class, you understand
the awesome power
the power of this thing
in your hand.
Whereas if you're just some kid on the street that's never done that and they give you a gun, all you've seen is the movie John Wick, and you're like, oh, nothing, pop, pop, pop.
Yeah. And that's something similar to Defense Against the Dark Arts, is learning how to shoot a gun. Right.
Right. And so again, that scene that was in the movie that South of Sunrise did with me and Paul and Grizz, is that's the scene. He clipped the scene that Umbridge is like, this is going to be a theoretical thing. We don't actually have to use magic, for this. It's like no, like there's something about the doing. There's that kind of knowing. If we
the propositional procedural
exactly, but it's that to actually do the thing, to actually have the gun in your hand, to feel the power of that thing and recognize it. That's where a deeper understanding, can come from.
Yeah, a great example of that in movie would be the movie Unforgiven. Where the whole point of that movie is to demonstrate, all this rootin' tootin' killing. It's not as little as you make it seem in a lot of westerns. And you have the one young kid who's like, I killed 5 people, and then he finally kills a person. It's like tearing him up. It's like, that's the first one, and I never want to do any of this again. And the great line from Clint Eastwood is, "It's a hell of a thing killing a man, taking everything he is and everything he'll ever be."
I read a great review of Unforgiven back in the day when I was in college when it came out, comparing the vision of Unforgiven to Homer, the violence in Homer, and it was really compelling. Speaking of Homer earlier on, but that there's something incredibly intimate about that kind of sometimes you're required to do thing. So what do you do? What did that? You asked the question about Defense Against the Dark Arts. I mean, does that kind of satisfy?
Well, yeah. So I mean, I feel like. I feel like we're in a little bit of a book 3, book 4 moment where it does seem like evil is becoming more clear and more manifest, and that we will probably need to be smarter about how to actually recognize it and address it. And I also thought that the Megan Basham book was sort of an interesting moment in that for evangelicalism.
I love this. No, because
it's like, okay, so there are these, moneyed interests that are often pretty partisan in their aims, that view basically the Republican-leaning evangelical electorate as a problem, and so we need to just degrade 5 or 10% of their support for the Republican candidate, and that could do us a lot of good. And so, how do we do that? Oh, well, we get them to care about climate change, and to care about, just a couple things that are a little bit left-wing coded, so that the next time they're hearing a presidential debate, maybe 2 out of 100 of them have a little bit more sympathy for our candidate next time. Right. And learning that we need to recognize that as a church, as an institution, that those forces will be after us in that particular way. And Megan Basham's coming in a very sort of black and white, this is evil. Anyone who cooperated it, I've got your receipts. You need to be something or another shamed, from my Twitter profile. And then some people are like, well, like Gavin Ortland, he had one video about climate change. Are we going to cancel Gavin Ortland? And like, are you really saying that, all these things are that black and white? And that's sort of an issue.
So I would say we're not in book 3 and 4. I would say we're in book 6. Because the evil is out.
I love it. Let's go.
Because so what happens in book 5? Everybody sees Voldemort's back, or at least the ministry does.
But because that's the big showdown with the glass, and
And so the Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, is ousted,
Yeah.
and now you have Scrimshaw
Yeah.
that comes in, but the ministry is infiltrated at that point. It's just that we don't know to what degree, and there's a lot of people in that middle ground that we don't know how far they are.
There certainly are a lot of umbrages around.
There's other umbrages around. There's other people that are less, like a Gavin Ortland, who, it's just this little thing about climate change, but he's still contributing, and the ministry is still lost. And there's still people that are denying how bad it is, or have no idea what to do about it. And there's only a few people that actually know how to fight it still.
Right.
All right. It's really Dumbledore and the trio.
A competency crisis.
A competency crisis, and a willing to know it, recognize it, and name it crisis.
And that isn't easy to do. So, like, even what Meg Basham does, it's like, to a certain degree, she's pointing out things that, in my opinion, have been obvious for like a decade.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's so frustrating, right? Because again, I know this is not my circus, not my monkeys, but there are absolutely the corollaries in my own church. I mean, we might even be deeper into book 6 than my evangelical brothers and sisters. But it's the compromised, corrupt. I mean, what is corruption? Right? It is that the body is there are parts of the body that are working against the healthy functioning of the full body, right? So I can hear both parts this being true, but I probably skew more toward book 6-ism.
And mainly because COVID seemed like, every time I read Order of the Phoenix, which I'm in the middle of right now, I think of COVID. Like there was stuff that was like blatantly false, blatantly false, and easy to see. I mean, I was looking at the stats of there were more people in 2021 under the age of 30 that were shot in Chicago than died of COVID in the state of Illinois. And that's easy to see. Like, you just look at the statistics, it's so easy. But nobody wanted to believe it or look at it or whatever. And if you put that out, people will make fun of you and whatnot.
And what percentage of the businesses that closed during COVID were small, minority-owned, or mom and pop style things?
And how many people
replaced by big chains?
Yeah, and how many people in like suburbia were like, "Oh, I just don't want to see it." Whereas like guys like me living in the west side of Chicago, that May of 2023, I had 3 people shot in front of my house. My kids were hiding underneath slides because they were afraid of getting shot. I mean, being a dad in that kind of environment, it's just like, imagine your kids. And I have to teach them, hey, this violence is out there, but we're okay. You're going to learn how to navigate it, and so on and so forth.
Meanwhile, the North Shore closes our exit ramps on the highway when things get too hairy and dicey, like during the Black Lives Matter riots. So we send our local police and we just close the highway exit.
Can't get
so if you looters, you're gonna have to go to like Milwaukee, I guess. You can't get off here, right? And like literally, that's what happened during those days.
But as long as you're capable of doing that, you don't have to see it.
Yeah, that's the part. Again, we don't have to jump down the Catholic rabbit hole. So let's sort of keep this to what Basham has sort of done here. I mean, how do I read it? Because I'm like one of those weird Catholics who likes to pay attention to a bunch of different things, because I really do see the patterns. What do you think she did? What did she expose? I mean, what do y'all think?
I think there was a lot of people that kind of could see it, but I want to see, like, almost like the doubting Thomases. I want to see the evidence. And she provided evidence to a lot of them. And I think, and we talked about this a little bit before, is like for guys like Ortland, it's like, to a certain degree, I don't think he was the main example of what she was talking about. But I think it revealed that he doesn't know how to respond well to accusations.
Yeah, it's also the first chapter.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't have to read for like Gavin Ortland. Like what? I thought he was like one of us.
Yeah, and again, he could have said stuff like, I think she's wrong about how that's perceived, but the bigger, there are significant problems within.
Her book is doing a good thing, and I feel like I was caught in the crossfire. I'd love to talk.
And would I respond differently? I might have responded just like Gavin, but I have to look at myself and be like, okay, if somebody accuses me of something, I need to be able to look at myself, see what's true, and try to find a way forward.
So again, as the outsider, let me think this out loud here. Gavin,
he's a lot like Bishop Barron.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yeah,
he's
because
smooth, slick. He's kind of rises above,
leans right, but likes intellectual respectability, and still has some institutional admiration and stuff like that, and is not over in rad trad land. but occasionally will punch left.
Yeah,
you know, when the Olympics get too crazy.
Yeah.
Right. So okay, good. So then so he partly that if we talk about sort of the big pretend, it would seem that he is sort of playing the role of like, I can kind of dabble with this as a signal, that I'm not a deplorable like those people over there. So he's part of that
the
corrupt
establishment
pretend.
is right every once
Right.
in a while. Yeah.
Right. So that's sort of how his role. I mean, I followed this stuff because I was really taken not so much by the Ortland thing, because I think that makes a certain amount of sense. I get that, and I could see why people are like, why would they? But man, Russell Moore, David French, and
Francis Collins.
Holy crap!
Holy crap! Yeah.
I mean, I had sort of that stuff.
Yeah.
Because those are like the different ministries in the Ministry of Magic getting slowly flipped one by one without you really seeing it. And it's like one of those things, like I had noticed evangelicalism moderating and with occasional flashes of semi-wokeness for a while. But I would have thought it was kind of silly to blame that on outside money. I'm like, this is just sort of like,
yeah, I always thought it was just drifting.
This is drifting, and this is
And
like
academia.
the suburban. This is suburban mom politics.
Yeah,
Right.
Totally.
And don't attribute to George Soros what's more properly attributed to moms hanging out with other moms and bringing their politics to church.
Right.
And that's also, maybe it's also a little bit true, right?
Yeah.
But then when like there really are these orchestrators with millions of dollars,
and what it does is says, evil people are just stupid, and there are a lot of stupid evil people, but there's a lot of real smart ones too, and you can't negate that. And on the good side, there's a lot of dumb good people, and there's a lot of real smart ones too.
I like to carry on. I like to sort of make my quips about spells and on Twitter. But I really feel like one of the powerful spells is exactly that little device, right? Don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to incompetence. It's like, but
well, that's the thing is that
was that Jordan Hall's tweet who said there's a difference between incompetence and malcompetence. What about if the Secret Service has been intentionally degraded?
Yeah, but none of those things are absolute, right? That's not an absolute rule, because sometimes it is malice, and sometimes it's malice trying to peer down,
right. And that's exactly right. That's what I feel like we live through. Is this like, it's very easy, and so I was thinking of Francis Collins, for instance, and I paid pretty close attention to the whole COVID thing as it was unfolding and driving myself crazy, right? I still, up until last week when I finished her book, was sort of filed Collins into this sort of like, like, oh gosh darn, what happened here? And how she got that transcript of that meeting that took place where like it was with students, or do you remember the part? It's a, where Collins and Moore are just saying all the stuff out loud, and ragging on basically doing a version of the bitter clingers from Obama and a version of Hillary Clinton's deplorable speech. And it's just all right there.
Well, and that's commonplace in the church. Like I've heard those things. I hear those things all the time.
Right.
Especially because I'm kind of a conservative. I grew up evangelical in a blue city, so you hear that kind of talk all the time. But like, it begs the question: Cornelius Fudge, was he evil or was he dumb? He was a little bit of both. Because it's like there were things that were done, but at the same time, he knew that if this comes out, he's not the right guy for the job, and he loses his job, and where does he go from here, and yada yada. Was Scrimger
that's right.
evil? I mean, Scrimger ended up sacrificing his life to save Harry, to not give any, but he still wasn't kind of the right.
But he doesn't get a complete free pass. There was still real costs.
Yes, and he was still trying to manipulate Percy against his family.
Yeah.
I think another thing that's interesting and relevant is Harry's continued love of the Muggles. Right? Like Harry never turns his back on
and
the
he has
Muggles.
no reason to love the Muggles.
Right. He has no reason whatsoever.
No
He has every reason to hate the Muggles as much as Voldemort does. But he doesn't. And I feel like the Muggles are in a certain sense the deplorables. And there is that sort of like, I can get why like a Gavin Ortland or a Francis Collins, although Francis Collins didn't grow up evangelical. He was like an adult sort of intellectual convert. But like if you grow up evangelical and you're like a smart kid and you go to the good schools and you study science, and then when you come back home on Thanksgiving break, there are people in your church who trust you less.
Interesting.
And that they are worried that you're going to betray us,
go to the dark side,
or look down on us, and that sort of reverse pressure is something that I have felt. Where I know it's like, come on, guys, I am working my butt off here studying all these things. I have things that I can tell you and that I can teach you. And they're like, well, not so fast. And that feeling, I think, can sometimes be the cause of those darn deplorables.
Yeah. And I do think that's an important thing to remember. And I have to remind myself of that. It's like, sometimes the deplorables are not, the deplorables are not, pure as the driven snow. And like, just because they're hated by all the people that I don't particularly care for, doesn't make them sort of,
well, it's this understanding of evil that goes inside of us. It's like everybody's deplorable. So or everybody has that potential. Everybody's totally depraved, as we Reformed people like to say. I was at a church. It was a dominantly Puerto Rican church. I'm Puerto Rican, and I was critiquing the leadership structure. It was terrible. It was just very illogical. And it was causing problems. And the pastor of that church said, "Oh, that's just because Mo's whitewashed." He didn't say it to me, because he knows that I'm not, and he would have had a big problem on his hands. But in his opinion, structure, he went to college. He must be whitewashed. And it's just like, dude, I live in a ghetto neighborhood than you. I'm more in touch with my Puerto Rican culture than you are.
But I'm the one being called whitewashed.
But I'm whitewashed because I'm critiquing him. But now I can hate him, or I can say, hey, I understand that nobody likes to be criticized that way, especially when you're in a position of leadership.
Well, and right, that's a threat.
Yeah, and I might not appreciate getting criticized in that same way, but kind of understanding that same kind of what I perceive as evil in him, I know that lies in my own heart. It allows me to understand him and also know that there's good in that pastor as well.
So in this sense, then, do you think that the book, Megan Basham's book, will help people understand what time it is?
I think it's a certain course, a certain chapter in Defense Against the Dark Arts, to wake up, like, you might have thought that this was a conspiracy, to a theory, to
another spell, conspiracy theory,
right? That to say and accuse people of these sorts of things. Well, look how real it actually is. And so then you have an arrow in your quiver against the dark arts, to know that these sorts of moneyed influence campaigns are a thing, how to sort of recognize the symptoms of them. But I still think, so what are we supposed to do with Gavin Ortland now? And like in Harry Potter land, Dumbledore is always trying to reintegrate, people who have even been a little bit tainted by the thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And we can't just, I feel like Megan is still a little bit very black and white, and in a way that is a little bit too conveniently partisan.
No, I guess I didn't read her book that way. Maybe just because me and her just kind of see a lot of the same things.
Writing on Twitter, I feel like maybe is a little bit more so.
To her defense, though, she's in the middle of
she is in the middle.
People are really
so.
Her.
I would be very feeling very black and white at this moment. So maybe that might be something. But I get your point. I mean,
But if we're in book 7, I would say that she's like kind of like almost like the snake figure teaching. What do they call them? Spells that you don't have to do the incantation.
The
mental spells. It's like there's a lot of stuff that people kind of talked about, or they thought, oh no, if they're going to use that against me, they're going to say it out loud. And she's uncovering. No, they're using spells that you don't have to speak out loud. That's behind the scenes, but they're still doing kind of evil things. Because I did find she puts a lot more disclaimers in the book than I would. Okay. And a lot of her activity on Twitter is kind of just crapping on those that are trying to crap on her.
Yeah.
And I guess I live a lot of my life that way.
Yeah.
And what was that? J.D. Greer? She also just nuked him from orbit, and he seemed to deserve every word of it.
Yeah, that was, I think I retweeted that. I was like, don't keep calling her bullshit, Meg Basham. Good Lord.
But she's very serious about this. She's not going to back down. And I think a lot of these people are used to, if we just give pushback, people will back off. And now they have to come to a decision. what are they going to do moving forward? Are they going to try to interact with this in a respectful way, which very few of them have?
Yeah.
Are we going to continue to value decorum like we always said we ought to?
Mhm.
Or are we going to go the other way? And I think there's a lot of people that are on the moderate side of the spectrum watching and saying, huh,
Yeah.
like I didn't think these people would go to that level, but they have. And then there's some people that are just like, I don't want to see this. And
Right. So think about what are the incentives to pretend? In other words, therefore, what is the cost of noticing?
If you're Russell
Right.
Moore, you have to be doing the thing where you have to have influence in the community that people want to influence, and a leadership position and stuff like that. But you also have to have the connections to the other side. And that's where the real danger is for those people. But the thing is like, so are we just going to not have leaders? Are we just going to not have evangelical institutions? Are we not going to elevate intellectuals at all?
Right. So again, in my context, like, what are we just going to like ditch the bishop? Are we going to ditch the college? Are we going to ditch the pope? It's like, well, there's a lot of like things that have lined up here. It's like
Are you going to ditch Notre Dame?
Right.
That's
right.
But
that's a great example.
That's the interesting thing with the Harry Potter, right? They don't ditch the ministry.
Yeah.
They ditch the minister of magic, which would be like a Russell Moore, David French.
Yeah.
They got to go. They still kind of stay on as advisors, but everybody kind of despises them, even their old allies. Yeah. And then you have a bridge, which is Scrimgeour. Yeah. Which Scrimgeour, you would think, head of the Orders, he's fought the dark arts, he would do well, but he still has his issues. Right. And eventually he gets destroyed by those evil forces. Yeah. And then eventually you have Shacklebolt, Kingsley Shacklebolt comes up, who was part of the Order the whole time. Yeah. So there's this transition phase. Like, to a certain degree, I've always thought of kind of Trump in that way. Like, I don't think Trump can be this great leader to lead us to prosperity, but I think he's the one that can get crapped on and eventually destroyed by the dark forces, but opens people's eyes to see the need for a person who values decorum and stuff like that. Yeah. Because I don't think a person that values decorum could ever get elected at this point.
I mean, this is something that I talked about with Bethel and Tripp, that in this weird environment, you need really strong counter signals to make sure that you are unacceptable to the establishment that's trying to influence you. And another thing I think about is like the Quibbler example, right? So when the Daily Prophet becomes untrustable,
it's great.
Right? Then you have to turn to the Quibbler to find the truth. But then the Quibbler will also be recommending to you articles about nibblers, right? It's Joe Rogan, right?
No, that's exactly right.
You can Joe Rogan will be the place where the truth is found, but you also have to put up with aliens and DMT elves and like all the other stuff that because he's
so think about. I was thinking about this, so think about the Daily Prophet, is it? The Daily Prophet, right, as the New York Times, right? And let's just say, what would you think about the world if your only source of information was the New York Times and the Washington Post, fine, and CNN? Like, just do a thought experiment over the past 5 years. What would you think? How close or how far off from the reality of things would you be? Now, what if your sole source of information is Alex Jones? Again, using sort of, you would also
be chasing nibblers,
right? You would also have an inaccurate map of the train, and so, but we are in this weird situation where all of those are captured in corrupt institutions, which are rendering an increasingly false vision of what's real. And
what's interesting is, by the time we're introduced to the Daily Prophet, like Rita Skeeter, somebody, right, you realize that actually the Daily Prophet isn't any better than the Quibbler,
right?
Period.
It has a different affect. It has a different status.
Rita Skeeter is Kathy Newman,
right? Exactly. It's a different kind of nonsense. Almost the same hairstyle,
right?
But yeah, it's a different kind of nonsense, but it is nonsense.
Kayfabe.
Yeah, and so you have to kind of start seeing it because there's still a tendency to see the Quibbler as less than the Daily Prophet.
And Lovegood, what's his name? Xenophilius?
Yeah.
Lover of the stranger, right? Which is,
So
it's a perfect name.
That's so
right,
great.
but he ends up betraying Harry and Hermione and
Yes, he does.
Ron when they're at his house because they've kidnapped Luna.
Right. For the sake of the love
Mm-hmm.
for his daughter.
And so and
you see the inverse, right, between him and Luna and Draco and Narcissa. She betrays Voldemort, he betrays Harry for the sake of their children.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but he's not thought of as an evil character. And interestingly enough, so you have Lucius Malfoy, who never goes to prison, right? He's contributed to a lot of this evil, but at the end, and so
he's too big to fail.
Yeah, but that's always going to be a thing. There's always going to be people who never actually get dealt with.
Nancy Pelosi's probably not going to be put in prison for her stock trading, right?
Yeah. For the and to a certain degree,
and they're going to get away with it.
Yeah, and that frustrates some of us. But it's one of those things where that never really bothered me when reading the book. Mm-hmm. It's almost like I don't even notice it because and to a certain degree, as I see Draco sort of moving, I'm almost happy that at least Draco raising Scorpius, who's his son, has access to a grandfather and somebody who's like, hey, I don't want to be that kind of thing. And so, there's all these interesting aspects that it is not black and white. That's why the narrative, the story structure is so powerful because it can account for those nuances in reality that we have a hard time classifying.
So this is so good. So so think about, so what we've been doing here, ostensibly we're having a conversation about a 7-book series that was published in, the early 2000s, right? And we're having that conversation. But what does this afford the three of us, right? Look at what, so we're using, again, I don't want to like that word, but we're
she has given the affordance for us to
to actually to see something more clear about real things, and again, I believe that Harry Potter's real, but that's a different kind of conversation. But it really does. I was this summer I took a group of kids to Oxford, and this year I decided. So we read a novel, but Brideshead Revisited. But I do a couple Lewis things, and I did Learning in Wartime and The Inner Ring, which I think she read. Anyway, Lewis talks significantly. He's like, we need a way, we need a way to understand the present, and we can't know the future. So we read the past, old books, right, as a way to provide some kind of necessary relief for what's going on in the present. I would add on top of that, we read Harry Potter, the series, let's say, so that it provides a kind of relief by which we can make sense out of, we could talk about the evangelical church, we could talk about the Catholic Church, we could talk about U.S. politics, but it does provide us with a very complex analogy by which to defend against the dark arts and the mind control and all those kinds of things. Because I think in our day-to-day lives we see a bunch of people who are, it's just weird. I know I live in a little bit of a bubble on an island in Rhode Island, but to see people walking around in a mask like now, and I'm not talking about an old person, I'm not talking about an immunocompromised person, I'm talking about somebody who's like working at Starbucks. It's like in Glenview, it's you can't even go inside anymore. It's just like it's a pickup only. That's a new thing for me. And there's somebody working in the back and has a mask on, and so what's wrong with that person?
Well, what's funny, something that's parallel to that you may not encounter very often is growing up, all the guys that were wearing their super baggy jeans underneath their butt crack. These are the guys that are most likely to have to run away from somebody.
Right.
It's really hard. So it makes no practical sense, but there is something.
It's a peacock tail.
Yeah, it's peacock tail. It signals something. And that signaling is always going to be.
Okay, so
I have managed to escape the cops despite the fact that my pants are around my ankles.
Sleep with me. Yeah. Right. So I was so maybe I misunderstood it then, because I was understanding like they were like this Starbucks worker was scared.
I mean, maybe, but I think it less
think-
has to do with that. I think there's a lot less rationalism that goes
Okay.
into it, as so much as the
Well,
signaling.
So it's a bit
I
of
think
relief.
they are scared, and
Like-
that they still do the thing that they taught makes them less scared 4 years ago.
Right.
I think
Right.
that's
Yeah.
a lot
Right,
of
right.
it.
So as a bit of relief, I was bringing my daughter to the ferry. She was going to visit a friend in Nantucket last week. And so we drive
there
to
once was a man from there.
Yeah. And so, it's like, it's pretty posh, all that sort of stuff. And, I walked into the Trader Joe's, which is right next to the place to get her a couple of things. And there was like a family, clearly, this was like an upper class white family, a couple of kids, and all of them were like dutifully masked up.
Yeah.
These were like young, healthy mom and dad and kids. And it's like, what must you believe at this stage in the game to wear a mask at the Trader Joe's in Hyannis, Massachusetts?
Well, it's also a signal of a certain kind. It's
Yes,
like I am
yes.
super
I
bought
so
into
care,
the elite.
right,
Yeah,
right,
I'm super bought into the
Yeah, so-
elite
so-
advice. I will embarrass myself in public
Mm-hmm.
and make my whole family embarrassed,
Yeah.
even though they know that it's no longer cool to wear the masks.
Yeah.
So
But that we are so loyal to the thing that we will do it longer than anyone else.
So I'm talking to my Protestant brothers here. Is it a kind of a version of a two-speed-ism? Right,
Yeah.
so if you think of like the medieval church, right, and so brothers and sisters, they would wear habits, right, sort of conspicuous clothing that signaled them as, I'm so serious about this Christianity thing that I'm going to wear a habit. I'm going to wear a rough coat, whatever. Is it like that? So are you so bought into the magisterial narrative that you will continue to wear a mask?
Or it's like a yarmulke or something like that,
that's
right?
yeah. Like I'm all in.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
all in. Yeah.
Yeah, and because again, the idea of the dark arts, right, is that a lot of these things can be used for good, right? Those signalings can be good, like for the priests to wear the collar,
Right.
like
Because they think they're protecting themselves and others from a dangerous thing that could kill people.
Yeah,
And they're willing to go through discomfort on behalf of themselves. and
So
others.
take it in the inverse. So when I first started my church, it was in the middle of COVID. My wife and I were kind of on different sides of the whole COVID thing. So my wife always wore a mask. I refused. So we started doing church, and I was the only one in church that didn't wear a mask. Yeah. But for some people that came to visit the church, they saw me as an unsafe person that they could be around.
Yeah.
And eventually the guys dropped the masks and then their wives.
Right.
That's kind of how it happened.
Right.
But it was one of those things that
That's right.
it signals to other people that may be like-minded or whatever,
Yeah.
hey, I'm like you.
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, when I was a young man, for a period of my life, it was brief, I'd wear my pants underneath my butt crack.
Yeah, right.
And it was a signal that where I go, especially because I'm light-skinned, it's like, hey,
I see what you're saying.
I'm like you.
Totally.
We're the same.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing with code switching too. It's hey, you're safe with me. We understand each other. And so there's a bit of that too, and it can be used for good, but it can also be used
so
for
code switching. Yes, I think it's an important concept to bring out here, because what about, I think so much of the Big Eva thing, going back to Meg Basham's stuff, is that she's sort of puncturing holes in elite code switching.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like, and I found, and again, I'm not a fundamentalist Christian in the way that we understand that word, but I found that last chapter amazingly compelling, in which she says, let me tell you why I'm writing this book. I'm writing this book because to water down the witness at its sort of most fundamental level, I would have died if I had not encountered the power of
the unadulterated, undistilled gospel.
And I'm like, wow, that was that. Oh, and so for me, it was a real moment. And I think all of us who are adult Christians, we have whatever our version of that moment might be, or the version of that story we might be. It is sort of recognition. Thank God I was able to hear the truth in an important and pivotal point in my life. Who knows what I would have been? And I think that is sort of that is to me the fuel of her book.
And I've seen that pattern within the evangelical world, is you get this watered down gospel and it lasts you for a couple of years, maybe in your adolescence, and then you hate the church after that.
Yeah.
And there's some people that have still gotten saved through that or become long-term Christians.
In Catholic circles, the tell for that is, I went to Catholic schools from kindergarten through 8th grade.
Yeah.
And so now, so number one, they think they know everything about Catholicism.
And I used to be an altar boy.
Exactly. Yeah, right. So I used to be like, let me tell you, it's all a load of crap. And of course, you just want to say, okay, so it's that weird thing where, so when you get the watered down gospel, right, you think that you have mapped territory, but you have not.
Yeah. And it's tricky because, like, so in hip hop culture, right, everybody needs to know Dr. Dre.
Yeah.
Right.
It's canon.
And if you're, so if you're somebody that's in hip hop culture, you know who Dr. Dre is, you know his songs, you know his lyrics, you know his collabs, whatever. Dr. Dre is one of the fakest street guys ever.
Right. Total fabrication.
Yeah.
A fabrication in the studio and a PR company.
And the hardcore hip hoppers know that, but he's still part of the canon.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, again, the Lucius Malfoy.
Yeah.
It's like he was revealed, but he's still kind of part of it.
That's great. I like that.
And you need those border characters. And Harry Potter has tons of those border characters that they can sometimes betray you, but they can also prove useful. Like, what's the guy who's the thief who's in the Order of the Phoenix?
Mundungus.
Mundungus.
Yeah.
Right.
Fletcher,
you need the guy who knows the word on the street. And you need the person who is on the borders that can help you gain information from the outside. And so that's like one of those things I'm worried about.
Even though you look down on those people, you still need that.
Right.
And this is true with a lot of the evangelical leaders. There's some of them like that this would be to a certain degree how I view like a Tim Keller. There's a lot of people that I know that were intimately blessed by Tim Keller and his work.
Yeah.
I have not. Actually, anything that I've read of his, I'm like, whatever. I can criticize.
What about The Meaning of Marriage? Great marriage counseling book. Anyway.
I haven't read that whole book, but
I know enough to know.
Yeah,
it means I know enough to know.
But it's one of those things where I cannot deny the blessing that other people have received from him.
Right. And he was from kind of the earlier era when one could play that interfacing role with less suspicion and less contamination.
Yes.
And then it's one of those things, he lived a little bit long enough to start to become the villain, or he died right at the cusp of that transition.
And so I have to hold, hey, again, he's a human being. They're capable of evil and capable of good. I mean, that's one of the great lines from the movie that's not in the book of the Order of Phoenix, when Sirius tells Harry, we're not, either good or bad. We have light and dark in all of us. It's what you choose to act on. And that's an important concept. Rabbi Zacharias, did he accomplish good things? Did he accomplish bad things? He did a bit of both.
Yeah, God, the corollaries are just, I see it all. Exactly, that same dynamic plays out.
Or a great character is who's the guy? I don't remember his name, but he was the leader of the Westboro Baptist Church. The whole God hates homosexuals thing.
Yeah.
So he was a big part as an attorney of pushing the civil rights movement forward. Like a big civil rights attorney.
Right.
At the end of his life, he was kicked out of Westboro Baptist because he said, I was wrong about all these things. I shouldn't have gone this way. And his home family kicked him out, and he kind of died alone. Right. Was he good or was he bad?
Right. And then one of the kids of Westboro Baptist is the ones who hosted the podcast. That was the witch trials.
Witch trials. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. It's like,
it gets real complicated there.
So I think that's where I would push back on Megan, that you have to maintain some of these relationships that even might seem risky.
But you also have to be like, so
you have to do it with eyes wide open.
Well, like Scrimger.
Yeah.
Harry doesn't treat Scrimger at all. No. Scrimger dies for Harry. So he has that good in him, and he contributes to the good. But Harry comes at him aggressively on the bad. And so it's one of those things where it's like, some people, because Harry gets some things wrong, Hermione gets some things wrong, is that I'd like to think that what Megan is doing is much more significant as to how her role is calling all this crap out. Now, dealing with the nuances, maybe that's for us to deal with. And for me to deal with among my congregation, right? The people that I shepherd over, the people that I teach, I have to explain to the nuance. No, you cannot hate David French. As much as he annoys the crap out of me, I can't hate him. Now, I can speak boldly against his work. And ideally, I can offer him a pathway towards remorse. Because if Harry can do that for Voldemort, who killed his parents and is responsible for all this evil, I can do that to David French. Oppose him, and if he wants to continue to destroy himself, that's for him to do.
I think that campus ministry will be one of those areas that's really caught in the crossfires of this. Like I was speaking to a friend who works with campus ministry, I won't name, but and he was like, saying the sorts of things like, well, I just don't understand why Christians would ever be against pronoun hospitality. And like, because they're on the front lines of all this stuff and are just swimming in this. And then there are people like Jordan B. Cooper, who is, super, hard-nosed anti-woke, but he's a campus minister at Cornell. But even then he will have some of the, there are some deplorables, guys, let's be honest, that like they don't, they need to elevate their game and have some more respect for intellectual culture, right? So like, I think campus ministry, it will be right in the crux of these tensions because the universities are at the crux of the blob. And then, caring about the future of young adults is something that, has heightened passion around it. And then, so how do you be a Christian in that setting? And the campus ministry is trying to guide and shepherd people in that context. And are you going to be a Jordan Cooper? Or are you going to be the sort of person who's like, I don't understand what's wrong with pronoun hospitality?
And the tricky part is so much of that is contextual. On the face of it, I'm like, oh, that guy's ridiculous that he's hospitable to but I don't know his context. There's a lot of people that will look at me in my context. I know how to negotiate violence in my neighborhood. Is it ever appropriate for a Christian pastor to even be able to negotiate violence?
Right.
Well, sometimes it depends on the context. During COVID, some punk teenager threw a brick at my car when my wife was putting in my 2-year-old little girl in. If one of that bricks hit my daughter or my wife, how am I going to react? I did chase those guys. I didn't catch them. I'm a lot more out of shape than that's when I realized I must do something.
But sorry to interrupt, but the thing, you're talking about campus ministry.
Which is what Dumbledore's army is.
Yeah, right. How long has that been corrupt in your estimation?
Well, I mean, when I was in college, right, we were dealing with the campus was trying to make all the Christian fellowships have an affirming statement that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of acronyms, what leaders are in and out of your fellowship. And so therefore, if your president becomes gay, you can't do anything about it. And then the campus ministries are like, well, what about our statements of faith? What about our own ability to determine who our own leaders are? Isn't it normal for any club to want the leaders of its club to be representative of that club, right? Could Westboro Baptist be the leader of the Gay Straight Alliance? So like, and that whole tension. And so it didn't feel like campus ministry was yet corrupt, but so many people that I knew that were involved in campus ministry, even worked for it and stuff like that, were so susceptible to going woke.
And I mean, the first time that I heard a minister just flat out blatant, heresy, again, in just broad terms, I'm not talking about little bits of, was a veteran intervarsity guy. And this was in 2003, maybe 2.
Wow. Yeah.
And he was like, I mean, I was shocked. And I'm like sort of like the innocent Catholic. I thought the corruption was just happening in the Catholic Church at that time. I didn't have a lot of exposure with evangelical stuff. That was sort of part of my introduction with the whole Fuller crowd and all of that. And I was just like, wow.
Yeah.
I always thought of like those, because the one guy that I had known in high school who was part of the InterVarsity movement was like a hardcore fundamentalist, basically. So I was really shocked by that. So but is that part of the understanding? Again, defense against the dark arts. It seems to me like point one is to recognize that darkness is real.
Well, and the accountability structures are going to be different, right? It's like to a certain degree when Harry starts the Dumbledore's army, no real accountability for Harry at that point.
True.
He does well there, but over time, if he kept that going, like that's not the best way to learn defense against the dark arts. I mean, for example, there's a friend of mine, Christopher Yuan, who became a Christian while he was in prison, and he was gay. and he would argue with the prison chaplain as to whether or not the Bible was okay with that.
Right.
He read the Bible thinking the Bible was not okay with him being gay himself.
Right.
As the new believer.
Right, so he's
but
just
the chaplain's trying to convince him that, you can remain gay. And so it's one of those things where it's just like, and that was very formative for him.
Yeah.
As he moved forward there. It's like, oh, wait.
And I think that is what was resonant with me in Megan's last chapter, is that, to have it mediated and filtered through corrupt shepherds, because I think that's what we're talking about, is a profoundly perilous reality. And so she's sort of writing this piece, it seems to me, like, look, I needed the full-throated thing. I didn't need wiggle room. I didn't need this. I needed to. I was a drug addict.
I didn't need pronoun hospitality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so then, and I find my frustrations like with the whole campus ministry bit. And you mentioned Notre Dame, for instance. Like, again, it's sort of comparable type thing, perhaps, is I mean, if we believe in the enemy, right, that the enemy is real and that he wants, like Screwtape, he wants to win souls for our for Satan. Wouldn't you think that the great source, where is all of your source housed between the ages of 18 and 22? Colleges, it's like, where does a predator go? A predator goes to the protein source.
And so the point of maximum leverage.
Right. So it's like, and yet we sort of pretend like this is the time in which we can sort of like.
But again, the problem there is who wants to be a campus minister. There's a certain
there's a selection
of people who will want that job. I mean,
yeah.
it's like, who wants to be a Navy SEAL? Who wants to be an undercover police officer? Who wants to do, there's a certain type of person. And
I bet a third half of your time is fundraising. And that is another thing that makes people vulnerable to the corruption. It's like, well, man, it would be nice if I weren't calling and mailing and emailing whatever, all of my giant donor
and then
base.
the lack of accountability. If you're a minister in a church, well, everybody's going to question you, and you have elders, and when you're in a campus ministry, that kind of accountability has to be sought out. It's not automatic. And when you don't have accountability, when you're not being forced to face the shadow inside on a regular basis, you're not fighting it.
Yeah. And that's where something like the Catholic Church, like maybe, I mean, it can put people in that position that don't need to fundraise. But I mean, there is money somewhere, and then the more money's collected up at the top, then that's also its own dangerous vulnerability. Whereas if it's $50 a month checks from a couple hundred different parents, that's a little bit harder to influence in a certain way.
Well, I think is important for you all to understand as Protestants, and I tweeted about this early on when I just started reading Megan's book, is that there are many ways to get paid. If the Shepherds for Sale thing is the sort of the handle, there are many ways to get paid. It's not just money, right? And so what you see in the Catholic Church, for instance, yes, certainly there are guys, high-level priests, bishops, etc., who amass a fortune, a sort of a cryptic fortune. But what they really want is power and influence, right? So sale it's not just a dollar. And I think that's an important thing for you all to realize, that it's not about, and again, we have so many sad examples of a Joel Osteen type who's got several mansions and his private jets and all those sort of things. Like, that's just so on the nose.
And the thing is that currency is power.
Right.
Because I mean, you think, going back to Harry Potter's rich, but his riches mean nothing in the Muggle world. Like, he can't spend it. I mean, although he could probably find a way to cash it in.
There's an exchange rate.
Launder
some
it's like breaking Bad,
galleons to pounds.
So you stay in the world. You stay in the world where your currency has value. And so sometimes it's not the money, but it's like, hey, I'm friends with these type of people who can get me this kind of private jet or whatever.
Or going to the fun party where the cool people
Yeah.
are. Like, you know, we are so gullible for some of those sorts of things that are way cheaper than money.
Or even just flattery. I mean, so I had a friend of mine, very good looking guy, didn't womanize really, like not in terms of physical, he didn't take advantage of people that way, but he always had women around him. And I think to a certain degree that satisfied an aspect of power. It wasn't about the sexual favors because they didn't do that for him, but just having a lot of women and pretty women
eyeballs
around
and
him.
attention was enough.
That's what he valued. That's what he got.
And that's an enduring, you know, that's an enduring part of this story, you know, that influence, power, currency. I think that's right. So
all right, we should probably wrap this up. Any closing thoughts?
This is cool.
This is cool. I've never done a live episode before, or I should say, I've never had my guests in the flesh before, and it's more fun and it's easier in a lot of ways.
More fun, you know, because body language is real. Being in a physical room with two guys is real, so that's been great. But I mean, my closing thought is that I know why people get nervous when we call something the Defense Against the Dark Arts. Either they think I'm an unregenerate nerd, which is true, or they think I'm some sort of like unrepentant culture warrior that I'm just not, you know. But I genuinely think that immersing yourself in the sort of the aspects of collective, you know, inheritance of books and stories and thinking and thought, like I genuinely think that gives you a chance to be a better human being. And I hope that people understand that. So, you know, reading Conrad's Heart of Darkness, it's a relatively short work. It's a lot of that darkness within the human heart kind of theme. Like I genuinely think that wrestling with something, even something small like a 97-page novella, can open you up to being a better human being. So,
I would leave saying, okay, a few things. Read Harry Potter. Go to church. Because the embodied conversation is far superior than the Zoom conversation. That's right. So wouldn't it be cool if we had an embodied TLC? Wouldn't it be cool if we had like this little corner pub?
An actual pub.
I'm working on it. If you want to be an investor, let me know.
That's cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I don't really see any questions out there in comment land. If you have a question in comment land, you have approximately 1 minute to get it in. But yeah, this has been fun. Thanks for letting me know that you're in town, Kale.
Well, I'll be here probably a couple times a year. So we should make it a thing.
And so there probably will be a Chicago conference. I feel like at this point, this is only the hardcore people who are still hanging out to know this. And so we haven't really announced this publicly yet, but we're working on the Chicago conference, and Kale is one of the guests slated for that.
If we can afford him.
If we can afford him.
High price.
We just need to find a weekend when he's visiting his mother-in-law.
That's right. That's right. Oh, you just happen to be here, Kale.
Well, that's what we did with Vanderclay last time, as he was in town for Synod. And then we used that as an excuse. Yeah, August 2025, Anthony, it's like almost exactly a year from like almost exactly to the date a year from today. So
providential.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody out there in comment land. All right.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Right.